Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Art Forum. If you haven't met me, I'm David Sequeira, and I'm the director of the Margaret Lawrence Gallery, and I'm also the person that gets to program Art Forum, and it really is my joy to welcome you here. And before we get started, I want to take a moment and invite you all to ground yourself in the knowledge of knowledge and an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land on which you're situated. For me, it's the traditional custodians of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And it's just so great to acknowledge that for a long time, for generations before the VCA or the University of Melbourne was thought of, that the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people practiced song and dance and made paintings and sculptures, that they shared stories, and that they practiced healing on this land. And it really is a joy to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, I do want to also take a moment to acknowledge that this is the last Art Forum for 2021, and there are some people that I want to thank. I want to really thank and acknowledge my colleague June Yoon, who's the gallery coordinator. You never see June, but she is always there in the background for Art Forum. A really big shout out and thanks to Nick and Tyson, our Auslan interpreters, who people don't know this, but Tyson zooms in from Japan. Nick zooms in from Perth every single week for us. A big shout out to my colleagues in the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music, especially those in external relations. And of course, a big shout out to my colleagues in the Melbourne Reconciliation Network who've helped us put on a number of art forums today, this semester. Now to our guest speaker, Katerina Teiwa. So born and raised in Fiji, Katerina is of Banaban and I-Kiribati and African American heritage. She's Associate Professor of Pacific Studies and Deputy Director, Higher Degree Research Training in the School of Culture, History and Language at the Australian National University. Katerina is also Vice President of the Australian Association for Pacific Studies, Art Editor for the Contemporary Pacific, a journal of island affairs, author of Consuming Ocean Island, and a visual artist. Her research-based multimedia installation, Project Banaba, exploring the impacts of phosphate mining, colonialism, antipodean agriculture and fertiliser, is curated by Yuki Kihara. Originally commissioned by Carriageworks in 2017, and it was on show at MTG Hawke's Bay, Ahuriri in 2019. Katerina's 3-screen video, Minelands, for Teresia, was part of a group show, Garden of the Six Seasons, at Paris site in Hong Kong in 2020. In late 2021, Project Banaba will open at Te Uru Waitakere Gallery in Auckland in collaboration with a Banaban community-based art revitalisation project, Te Kaneati. Wherever you are, please make Katerina very, very welcome. Katerina, over to you now.
Thank you so much, David. Well done there with the pronunciation. We did a lot of practicing before this. Kamna Maori and Nisambula Vinaka. Greetings, everyone. I'm Katerina Teiwa, and I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri nations here not in Kiribati, in Canberra, in the ACT. Originally, I was supposed to be in Melbourne for a residency, so I'm a bit sad that I couldn't come down to Victoria, but I'm so pleased that we could do this talk virtually. But I do want to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples. Canberra has for many generations been a meeting place for Aboriginal peoples. And I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians, ancestors, elders, and descendants. So thank you so much to David and to your team for having me join you today. And also, I just want to say thank you to Alex Martinez-Rowe and her students in the drawing program of the Fine Arts School, who I've also been visiting with. I have many wonderful colleagues at the University of Melbourne, some of whom I think have joined us today. So hello to them as well. I'm just going to start screen sharing and hopefully that will all work fine. Please let me know if there are any problems in terms of what you can see. Okay. If you can't see anything, somebody might have to unmute their camera, unmute their microphone and let me know.
Yeah, we can see everything, Katerina.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So I just want to mention before I start that my presentation does contain images of deceased persons, and they are our Banaban and I-Kiribati ancestors. Okay. So before I continue, it's always important for me to locate myself or to position myself. I am a Pacific Studies scholar, and the area in which I work is particularly Fiji and Kiribati, but my work crosses Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and many different parts of the Pacific. And I have ancestral connections, particularly to the islands of Teiwa and Barnaba in Kiribati and Turambi Island in Fiji. And I also have ancestral roots in Washington, DC, in the East Coast of the United States. These yellow triangles represent places that are important in terms of my life journey, my research journey, the kinds of things that inform my arts practice. And everything I do is usually quite specific to particular places and sites and histories and my connections to those places. So the stories that I will share today will involve a number of these sites. Particularly the island of Banaba, which is in the Central Pacific. It's there in Kiribati near the equator, and its closest neighbor is Nauru. So many of you may be more familiar with Nauru, which is often in the Australian media because it hosts a refugee detention center on behalf of the Australian government. That island is Banaba's closest neighbor. And it's also an island that was mined for phosphate. And I'm going to be talking a lot about phosphate mining today because the histories of phosphate mining inform my research and my arts practice. But this is us getting located in the Pacific. The other thing I should mention is that Banaba has two names. Banaba is the indigenous name, and Ocean Island is the European name. And often Banabans and others who talk about Banaba use both terms, either Banaba or Ocean Island. The other thing I should mention is that I have two children, and every now and again you may hear some background noise or some involvement of my children in this presentation. So hopefully we can all go with the flow on that. Okay, so just zooming into Barnaba a little bit. It's 6 square kilometers. As I mentioned, it's near the equator, and often when people think of the Pacific, they think of the Pacific as a place of many very small islands. And often they assume that that smallness also means that they're fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things, whether that's national issues, regional issues, international and global affairs. But Banaba, all 6 square kilometers of it, was actually quite important to global affairs and particularly to global agriculture. So the kind of work that I do tells this story or stories of a particular spot in the Pacific that many would have assumed is small and insignificant, and just how incredibly it was important to many other countries, but particularly the British Empire and countries, settler colonial societies of the British Empire, such as Australia and New Zealand. For Indigenous Banabans and for I-Kiribati in general, our concept of land and of identity and of belonging is rooted in this idea of te apa. Te apa means the land. In this case, it refers to the rock of Barnaba, the phosphate rock of Barnaba, but it also includes the people. So in our Indigenous concept of being and belonging, land and people are deeply connected. They're not separate things. Land and people are deeply connected. We come from the land comes from us. They are one and the same. So when I'm speaking of land, I'm speaking of people. When I'm speaking of people, I'm speaking of land. And this value, this concept underpins all my work and my value system across all my different roles that I play in academia, whether as a teacher, a researcher, an artist, even an administrator, and certainly as an activist and an advocate for the Banaban people. So keep that in mind. Land and people are one. Now, Banaba's almost completely made of phosphate, and phosphate comes from phosphorus. And phosphorus is a very, very, very valuable and important mineral, which underpins a lot of life on the planet. So one of the reasons why this tiny spot in the middle of the Pacific was so important is because it is made of phosphate. And phosphate is critical to global agriculture. So you don't have to read everything on this slide, but phosphate fertilizers that were manufactured from the rock of Barnaba and from the rock of Nauru allowed humans to double their food production. It allowed farmers to increase their agricultural production, and that meant increasing their exports, increasing the entire commodity chain of exports that comes from farming. And this is why everyone was really interested in Barnaba. Before they knew there was phosphate there, they weren't so interested. But once they discovered phosphate on the island and realized how important it was for fertilizer manufacturing and therefore important for farmers, it became something that was very, very valuable and critical to agricultural security and food security for places like Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere. And so if you're interested, you can look up the geochemical cycle of phosphate and just see how long it takes to form within our environment. It takes millions and millions of years. But in the story that I will share, which very much informs my arts practice, that island that took millions and millions of years to form was destroyed in about 80 years by industrial mining processes that then fed global agriculture. So millions of years to create an island, which becomes a rock that is part of our heritage and our identity, and just 80 years for that rock to be extracted and for the surface of the island to be destroyed and devastated. So I'm very concerned with these sorts of histories, and I follow these histories and these stories. So a lot of the work that I do has been inspired by my elder sister. And in David's introduction, he talked about part of my exhibition, which is called Minelands for Teresia. And it was my elder sister who originally started exploring and investigating our Banaban histories and trying to figure out, where did we come from? How did we get to where we ended up in Fiji? And which kinds of powers and authorities, controlled this phosphate mining industry, which led to the displacement of Indigenous Banabans. She wrote a poem called Minelands. And so I just wanted to read a part of that poem. Well, I'll read the whole poem actually, because it tells the story far better than I could. So I'm just going to bring the poem up. And I will need my glasses for it as well. Okay, so Mineland, an anthem. This land is Mineland. It used to be our land. From Tabyang to Tabwewa, from Bokonikai to Uma, birds made this land for posterity. This land is Mineland. It used to be our land, but then we leased it to greedy miners who only saw it as something called phosphate and used it for their prosperity. This land is Mineland. It used to be our land, but now Ocean Island fertilizes their land. And although they gave us a bit of their money, they left us with other kinds of poverty. This land is Mineland. It used to be our land, but now we're living in the Fiji Islands. And though we've had our fair share of problems, our future's full of possibilities. So my sister used to perform that poem to the tune of, "This land is my land, this land is your land." And unfortunately, she passed away in 2017. So recognizing her legacy and the impact of her original research is really important to my work. And I honor, all this work and effort and the beautiful poetry she wrote about Barnaba in a lot of what I do. She also wrote it as a treatment for a film project. So if anyone's interested in making a film about this down the line, it's full of all kinds of interesting twists and turns and stories and dramas. So for Project Banaba, which is my traveling multimedia exhibition, I basically follow the Banaban people. I follow all those who are involved in phosphate mining. I follow and I track the land and where the land ended up, because phosphate mining essentially means scooping up tons of rocks and then shipping it across the ocean and distributing it across farming fields. So I track this land, I follow the rocks, and I try to follow stories about the people and the land and the rocks and the fertilizer and where it ended up. And I reflect on what all of that means, what kinds of new and complicated and controversial relationships emerge out of the displacement of people and out of the extraction and distribution of their land. And what does it mean for our land to end up in other Indigenous lands? What kinds of new and complicated kinships grow out of my Indigenous land being used to fertilize Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia, which is where most of the phosphate went. In order to do this work, I do a lot of archival research. So a lot of the stories and a lot of the records about Barnaba are contained in archives all over the world, but particularly in Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom, some in Fiji, in Kiribati, and a few other places. I've done quite a lot of my research in the National Archives of Australia, where there are over 500 meters of files, folders, and records about Banaba. So 1/2 kilometre of records in the Australian archives about this 1 square kilometre island. And that is a little bit of an indication of how critical this island was for a sense of national security. So every single government department in Australia had files on Barnaba and Nauru because phosphate was that valuable. I work in a few other archives, including the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau and the Maud papers in the Pacific collection of the Barnaba Library at the University of Adelaide. So I'm going to tell a few archival stories from those collections, but I also highly value pretty much everything that's digitized on Trove. So some of you may know what Trove is, this amazing, wonderful portal into many, many historical records, newspapers, files, and folders, which we continue to hope the federal government and others will fund well into the future, because Trove is a treasure of many, many things, not always accurate records of the past, but they allow us to interpret and reflect on the past in our ways, using our value systems as Indigenous peoples. I love maps, and I love following journeys between islands. So as I was doing my research, which I've now been doing over 20 years, I came across all different kinds of archives, textual archives, photographic archives, moving images, and I would sort of put them together and try to map and follow these stories of phosphate and what happened to the phosphate after it was extracted from Barnaba and then flowed into other lands. So I locate these stories and then I connect them through my arts and through my research, but I use different types of archives. I don't just focus on the text. I look deeply at photographs. I stare for a long time at still and moving images, and I try to bring our histories and our stories and our lands back to life, especially because they've been displaced and dispersed. And if you think about land and people being one, it has these profound implications for our sense of belonging and of indigeneity. This is one particular fragment from the archives that I found at in the University of Adelaide, which kind of sparked a real intense emotional reaction. The Banabans over time became quite upset about all the mining that was happening on their island, and they took their case to the United Nations, and they took the British to their own high court, and they sued everyone. And one of the things they said was, these people, these colonizers, are taking the bones of our ancestors and they're distributing it, they're spreading it across the fields of Australia and New Zealand. This idea that, you know, our ancestors who'd been in the land for over 2,000 years and were now being mined and extracted and entering food chains was something that was very disturbing to Banabans and would be to many Indigenous peoples. So I found this fragment in the Barnaba Library at the University of Adelaide, which is the only record, like the only paper record that I have of my great-great-grandmother, who was Banaban and whose lands were mined out. And on it, the colonial administrator wrote next to her name, "Finished." Finished. So there's my great-great-grandmother, there's her children, and next to it was "Finished." And that was part of what inspired me to bring people back to life. This idea that someone thought they could finish the Banabans or finish up the land, and that would be the end of it. There's lots of records like this about Barnaba throughout the archives, and some of them appear in my book and elsewhere, including this one from the Sydney Morning Herald, which talks about how 500 Ocean Island-born natives cannot be allowed to prevent the mining and export of a product of such immense value to all the rest of mankind. Again, that's how valuable the phosphate was. This is just another image of the kinds of tributes and monuments that were built to honor the Europeans that discovered the phosphate on Banaba. And part of my recovery and reclaiming of these stories from the archives is to also honor the lands and the peoples who were incredibly impacted by the mining. There are more tributes to the Australians and the New Zealanders than there are to the Banabans. And there was a lot of money that was made out of the phosphate mining as well, but that's another story. So in my work, I sort of systematically tried to think about what happened to the island. How did the island get transformed over time? And what does it mean to turn an island and rocks into fertilizer? So if you're from Victoria, you might have seen across the landscape, you have these silos and these storage containers for phosphate. Some of them say pivot on them. And Pivot, which is now, I believe, Pivot Insightec company, has been around for a really long time and was one of the big companies that extracted the phosphate, was part of the industrial transformation of Barnaba, which turned our rock into superphosphate fertilizer and then spread it across the fields of Victoria. Melbourne was the company headquarters and kind of ran the whole show, bringing the phosphate in from the Pacific and then distributing it across Victoria. So I tracked this story and this transformation of the island and how it ends up in Australia. I'm just going to move. This is just an image or a couple of images by a photographer named Wolfgang Sievers, who took amazing pictures of industry in Australia in the 1960s, including the Pivot Fertilizer Factory in Geelong, which received a lot of our phosphate. So whenever I see images like this, I am seeing flows of our land into chemical and industrial contexts, which then transform it into something that gets consumed by others. So I do a lot of reflection on consumption and commodity chains, and I wonder what that means for Indigenous people like us who belong to rocks. So what happened to the Banaban people? Their lives, completely transformed, their lands uprooted and mined. These are the sorts of archival images that I'm staring at over time, and I'm trying to bring people back to life, trying to bring rocks back to the island, or think about where they've ended up in the world. I'm also thinking about the lives of Europeans on the island and the kinds of towns and mining towns that they built up and what that means for Pacific people. But at the end of the day, the island was, destroyed, and 22 million tons of it extracted and shipped off to Australia and New Zealand. So my research then brought all of these stories together, and I continue to disseminate my research in different forms. How do I tell stories about this island, which is now a very dilapidated kind of post-industrial, rusty place? How do I remind people about what happened, how it's important still to Australia and New Zealand, how it's important for people to recognize and take responsibility for what happened, and how do I help convince people that we still need to rehabilitate the island and get some justice for Banabans. So this is what inspired then my arts practice. Many of the Banabans ended up on Rambi Island in Fiji, which is just here in the northern part of Fiji, and many of my uncles and my aunties and my family members live there. And we have this sense of identity that situates us between Fiji and Barnaba. So we have this very multi-sided kind of Indigenous identity, which is still Indigenous, but is between islands and is belonging to lands that have been dispersed. I'm going to actually come back to that other slide in a minute, but I wrote a book about it called Consuming Ocean Island, and that's what academics do. We write books, but I wanted to share this story much further. I wanted the general public, especially in Australia and New Zealand, to understand how Banaba informed, not informed, but actually fueled their agricultural development. Farms are seen to be the cornerstone of economic development in both Australia and New Zealand. I needed the general public to understand that this history had massive impacts in the Pacific. And so I worked with various artists and various institutions to try to tell this story in different ways. So this is one collaboration I did with the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papatongareva, in Wellington. And this exhibition was up for, well, I think it's still up. So it's been up for over 12 years now, telling this story about Banaba. I also shared my work with different kinds of artists over time, and I would ask them, I would give them fragments of the archives, and I would say, how would you interpret this story? How would you tell this story in your own way? So these are images of the interpretations of visual arts honours students from the University of New South Wales who are working on a project kind of reimagining my research in visual form, in these illustrated styles. So I would share all of these different stories of mining and research, and they would come up with their own stories about it. And I would give them those basic concepts like land and people being one, so that they could run with that story in different ways. I worked quite closely with this particular artist to create a comic book chapter for a project that was based in Germany, where we then kind of they worked with artists all over the world to tell different kinds of phosphate stories in ways that were accessible, particularly to high school and university students. So after sharing my research with a variety of artists, I was eventually challenged to put on the artist hat myself and try to tell these stories in my own way, because over 20 years, I'd accumulated a lot of different kinds of images and films and texts about Barnaba, so many stories about Barnaba. And I had this background in dance, and I would often, participate in performing arts activities and productions where I would tell this Barnaban story through the performing arts. But as I continued my research and as I began to accumulate so many different visual images about Barnaba and what had happened, Yuki Kihara, who is now my curator, challenged me to put on the visual artist hat and tell these stories through these multimedia formats in my own way. And one of the things I always wanted to do is ensure that I wasn't trying to speak for other Banabans on my own, but to always bring the ancestors into that space, so that this was somehow always a collaborative kind of process and not just Katerina, the individual, putting on the artist hat and then trying to tell this story to wider audiences. So there are images, there are lots of images of ancestors in my exhibition, and they're there as custodians of the land and also as ancestors. So I bring them into that space in a way to watch us and to watch others as they experience this story. So Project Banaba was originally commissioned by Carriageworks in Sydney in 2017. And I worked with a team of people to put together different interpretations of this research that I'd been doing for 20 years. And I had a very strong sense visually of what it would look like, because I'd made films, I'd done performances, and I'd been contemplating this massive collection of records about Barnaba in many ways for a long time. So it was almost like I did super slow research and reflection over 20 years. And then bam, I was ready to turn it all into the visual arts, into this multimedia installation. So I combined images of the ancestors, photographs from the archives. I screen printed texts from the archives onto textiles that represented superphosphate fertiliser sacks that were distributed across Australia and New Zealand. I let the archives and the images kind of inform the aesthetics of the exhibition, but I also tried to recreate the Barnaban landscape. So Barnaba, the source of phosphate on Barnaba comes from two sources, the sea and the sky, through bird droppings, through guano. So I always try to hang things from the ceiling in order to invoke this idea of phosphate coming from the sky, from birds and from bird droppings. So we hung textiles in the space, and I also had a 3-screen projection based on my own film work and on archival moving images from the 1930s and the 1950s. And I created this kind of historical remix of Barnaba, where I bring Barnabans in the present together with Barnabans in the past, phosphate in the present together with historical and industrial transformations of the island. So it tacks back and forth between the past and the present. And I also put a timestamp on it. I can't get rid of my academic hat too much. But as you weave through the exhibition, you kind of get a sense of how things have changed over time. And I just pull these quotes and fragments out of the archives, and I stamp them on these textiles. So I might just let these images flow for a little bit, because I have to wrap up soon, just for you to get a bit of a sense of what it looked like. This is a slightly different version, which was, as David mentioned, we had at MTG Hawke's Bay, Tai Ahuriri, which is east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. And it was right down the road from a phosphate processing plant. So having the exhibition there, you know, about 5 minutes away from the phosphate factory, became quite a conversation starter for a lot of people in Napier who actually didn't seem to know the history of phosphate mining in the Pacific, or that particular phosphate factory up the road processed a lot of Banaban and Nauruan phosphate. So we had this one at MTG for a few months. And the space was slightly different. So we played around a little bit with the textiles and the 3-screen projection. And wherever I take this exhibition, I also bring in elements of history that are particular to the places that I'm taking the show to. So in the context of New Zealand, there's a very iconic image of top dressing, which is distributing fertilizer from the sky. And so I used this stamp from the 1960s to kind of reference this idea that our island flows all the way to New Zealand and then gets distributed from the sky. In Australia, it was distributed by trains. So I'm interested in these planes and these trains that end up distributing Banaban phosphate. The last part of the exhibition is actually it's quite contemporary, and it's non-archival in the sense that as people kind of move through the space and, maybe experience some sadness around, this story, which is not necessarily a happy story, I also, want to share with people that Banabans are very resilient, they're very creative, even though they got displaced from their island, and they've been displaced now for many decades in Fiji. Banabans have come up with all kinds of creative and resilient ways of surviving and of reconnecting with their culture and their heritage. So I have something that's called a photo reef on one wall of the exhibition, which kind of shows people getting on with life, singing and dancing and fishing and doing the laundry and hanging out and just getting on with things. We never forget our history and our past, but Banabans are very strong people and still strongly connected to their culture and their history, even though the displacement caused a lot of cultural confusion as well. This is my cousin fishing off the coast of Rambi, again, getting on with life. These are some of the images from that photo reef. And this is why I do what I do for my community, for my family, for our people, for other Pacific Islanders that this history and this story resonates with. And I just want to end with this particular image of the latest iteration of Project Banaba, which now very much connects with Banaban diasporic communities in New Zealand. And through the project, a Creative New Zealand grant was obtained and is now funding a lot of cultural revitalisation programs, which we're really, really excited about as we work with traditional knowledge holders and practitioners, to, again, bring back to life different aspects of our culture and our history and indeed our lands. So I just wanted to end there with this particular image. And despite the pandemic and the lockdown, I hope we can, we might have to go virtual on some of this, but we're still hoping to launch the exhibition in early December. Kampasin Rapa and Vinaka Vakalevusara for listening.
Thank you so much, Katerina. That was amazing and so incredibly generous of you to take us through all of the spaces of your practice and allowing all of the aspects of the practice to trickle into each other, from this very detailed archival practice to being an academic to installation in museums. It's been just terrific. Thank you so, so much. We've got time for a few questions. And the first question I want to ask about is the materiality of your work, because there's a lot of emphasis on textile. And I was just wondering if you could talk about what your attraction is to textile and why that matters for these photographs and the archival material that you deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I might just bring back a couple of these images from the archives, because I spend a lot of time staring at old photographs. And one of the things I got really fascinated with was clothing and textiles, because they are part of the transformation of Banaban life and Banaban culture, and almost helped facilitate the extraction of the land. Because along with the mining came the missionaries, of course, they always come together, economics and religion working together to impact Pacific peoples. And so clothing and covering of the body was an important part of the beginning of, disconnecting Banabans from aspects of their past and their heritage. So, you know, covering everyone up. And then I kept thinking about what kinds of materials, like what were these fabrics that you know, the company and the British colonial administration and the missionaries were bringing onto Barnaba, and how were people dressed differently? So there was a lot of cotton, there was a lot of, you know, linen, calico, things like that. But I was particularly struck in this image about the different ways that mining workers and colonial administrators and laborers were dressed, and the different stages of covering. So you can see a figure, or at least I hope you can see a figure all the way in the back there without a shirt on. And then you can see some figures here who sort of head to toe in white, or I'm assuming is white. They're black and white photographs. And then you can see a laborer who in this case is from Japan with a hat and with, you know, some sort of head covering. So, you know, today in a mine and on a working site, the regulations around how you need to be dressed and health and safety and all of that are really particular. But on Banaba, you'd see people without shirts, without shoes, without hats, working at a rock face, like, you know, with a wheelbarrow, with the shovel, and the level of coverage would be different, whether you were white, whether you were Asian, and whether you were a Pacific Islander. So clothing and different stages of dress and undress were a signal. They signaled racial hierarchies and relations on the island. So when I decided to use textiles then in Project Banaba, particularly in this part of the exhibition, I was thinking of all of those things. I was thinking about the importance of fabrics and materials to the transformation of Banaba. But as you can see here, we appliqued something to the back of these textiles. So on the front, these textiles represent phosphate sacks. So they're Hessian, which was one of the fabrics that was used to distribute a lot of different things. But on the back, we put cotton and linen and calico to signal the empire. But they're in the shape of pinnacles, which is what's left on the island after you mine it. So the cotton and the calico and the linen are like the bones of the land that are left behind.
Right, thank you. There's a question that asks if you've ever had to censor your storytelling when presenting the sort of topics that you cover.
I do a little bit of self-censoring in that I don't tell certain stories that are not mine to tell. Banaban knowledge and Banaban traditional knowledge, and especially genealogical information or knowledge about land and who the land belongs to, are not for public consumption. So I try to keep it a very general level when talking about certain things. So I self-censor in that way. Politically, though, I tend not to, in terms of talking to people about the responsibility of Australia and New Zealand and Great Britain towards Barnaba, which is still requires justice. However, usually when I talk to the media, or I talk to, most recently I talked to a film crew from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in New Zealand, after I give my impassioned speech, then I go, is that, you know, like, will your particular audience be okay with that? So I sort of ask the question after the fact. But I am careful about certain kinds of information, because when I started doing my research in Canberra many years ago, I made inquiries with the fertiliser industry, and they removed a lot of information from their websites about Barnaba after I started making my inquiries. So I know this is sensitive from many government perspectives, but it's still an important, well, it's absolutely an important story to continue to tell, because Banaban still required justice in this case and a rehabilitation of the island.
We've got time for one more question. It's from Alex, and she asked the question, a few years ago, you mentioned to me that you are interested in stories of disobedient Banaban women. Can you share one of the stories that you're working on, that you're working with on that topic?
Alex, which Alex?
Martinez. Alex Martinez, right.
Oh, Alex, I'm telling stories about disobedient Banaban women. Oh, thank you for pricking my memory. So yes, this is one of the, the details of the Banaban story, which I could do a whole nother different project on. But one of the impacts of the company and colonialism and definitely missionization was it impacted gender relations. It impacted Banaban gender relations. And you can see through the stories and the archives that Banaban women and Banaban men started to act a little bit differently towards these opportunities, right? These economic opportunities that were coming from these mining companies. And so at one point after mining had been, had proceeded for a while, and Banabans were like, ooh, these people, they don't want a few rocks. They're going to take all of the land. The tensions emerged between Banaban men and women. And there are stories in the archives of bulldozers pulling up to begin, mining a new section of the island, and of the women holding on to the trees, clinging to the trees and not wanting to let go in the face of the bulldozers. And so what happened there was some Banaban men then tried to pull their women off the trees and say, come on now, they have to go ahead and do their work. But the women could see very, very clearly the long-term impacts of the mining. And this is a story that, it's particular to Barnaba in this case, but it's also one that resonates across the Pacific, where these huge, economic or military or aid and development projects come along, and sometimes Pacific men will be like, oh yes, good opportunity, and often they are the leaders, so they'll be the first to sign. But it's Pacific women who often can see very clearly how whatever activity it is, and in this case mining, is going to have these massive flow-on effects that will be terrible for their children and their descendants into the future. So this is a part of the, of our Banaban history, and it is a little bit sensitive too, because gender relations tend to be quite sensitive in Kiribati, that needs further work and further reflection, because the women did hold onto the trees in the faces of the mining bulldozers.
Mm-hmm. Katerina, thank you so much for today. Like, really, on behalf of everyone here, it's just so great to be in your presence. Your love of sharing stories in a way is just so magical, because it kind of, it's so about you and so about Banaba, but it's also about every person. There's this kind of micro, macro, localized and globalized quality about your experience. And we don't take it lightly that you shared all of that with us today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. To our audience, thank you for joining us throughout 2021. We love that you, found a time for us during your busy Zoom life in lockdown Melbourne and beyond. And really, wherever you are, please stay safe. And we look forward to welcoming you to Art Forum in 2021. But wherever you are, please thank our guest speaker, Katerina. Thank you again, and goodbye, everyone.
Kampasin Rapa, thank you so much, everyone.